One dance, that's all it took. In the middle of a crowded charity gala, his hand found mine, his eyes locked on me, and suddenly the world faded away. I didn't know his name, but I knew I was in trouble, the kind of trouble that changes your life forever. Before I tell you how one dance turned into the wildest, most unexpected love story of my life, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of my stories about love, betrayal, and everything in between. Trust me, this one is going to stay with you. My name's Maya, and I'm 25 years old. Most days, my life is quiet and predictable. I work as an assistant at a small event planning company, the kind of place where we mostly handle birthday parties, retirement luncheons, and the occasional small town wedding. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I'm good at it. Organizing things, making sure the flowers match the tablecloths, keeping things running smoothly while staying in the background. That night, though, nothing about it was normal. It started with a phone call from my boss at 6 in the evening. I was halfway into my pajamas, a bowl of leftover pasta in my lap, watching a reality show I'd seen at least 3 times. She was frantic. Maya, I need you at the Jefferson Hotel ballroom, now. Candace called in sick, and we're short-handed for the gala. The gala. I knew exactly which one she meant. The annual Hearts for Hope charity event, the one where billionaires, celebrities, and the city's most powerful people came together in one sparkling champagne-filled room to outbid each other on priceless art and vacations for a good cause. I almost said no. I wasn't dressed for a gala. I wasn't mentally prepared for a gala. But my boss's voice had that urgent, no questions allowed tone, so 20 minutes later, I was in my little black work dress, swiping on lipstick in the back of an Uber. The moment I stepped into the Jefferson Hotel ballroom, I felt it, the shift in the air. Everything sparkled. The chandeliers looked like they were dripping with diamonds. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated through the crowd, balancing silver trays stacked with champagne flutes. The women wore gowns that probably cost more than my rent for the year, and the men, well, they looked like they'd stepped out of magazine covers. And then there was me, standing there with my clipboard, trying not to stare at the sheer amount of wealth on display. My heels suddenly felt too cheap. My dress felt too plain. Even my hair, which I'd tried to pin up neatly, seemed to rebel, curling at the edges from the misty air outside. I reminded myself I was there to work. My job was to make sure the silent auction tables stayed stocked with bid sheets, refill pens, and answer any questions about the night's schedule. Easy, mechanical. No reason to mingle or draw attention. But as I wove through the crowd, I couldn't ignore the way people moved in this world. They didn't just walk, they glided. They didn't smile politely. They measured you with their eyes, deciding in a heartbeat if you were worth talking to. I'd never felt more like an outsider in my life. Still, I kept my head down and my hands busy, focusing on the job. I told myself I'd get through the night unnoticed. What I didn't know then was that someone I'd never met, was already watching me from across that glittering room. I was standing near the silent auction table, straightening a stack of brochures, when I felt it, that strange sensation you get when someone's eyes are on you. It's not something you can explain exactly, but it's like your skin knows before your mind does. I looked up just to casually scan the room, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't standing with the crowd. No, he was off to the side, leaning slightly against one of the marble pillars, holding a glass of champagne that he didn't seem all that interested in drinking. His suit was black, perfectly cut, the kind you know is custom made even from across the room. The silver in his hair caught the light in a way that made it look almost regal. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were this deep, steady gray, the kind of eyes that didn't dart around the room like everyone else's. He wasn't scanning for the next conversation or calculating his next move. He was looking directly at me. I froze for a second, unsure if I should look away or hold his gaze. My first instinct was to check behind me, thinking maybe he was looking at someone else. But there was no one there, just me, in my plain black dress, clutching a clipboard like a shield. It didn't make sense. Men like him didn't notice women like me, not in rooms like this. I'd seen enough of these high-profile events to know the unspoken rules. The glamorous women in couture gowns got the attention. The staff stayed invisible. And yet, here he was, watching me like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. I told myself to stop overthinking and get back to work, so I turned my focus to adjusting the centerpiece on the table. But curiosity got the better of me, and a few seconds later, I glanced up again. He was still there, still watching. Our eyes met for just a heartbeat longer this time, and something passed between us. It wasn't flirtation exactly, more like recognition, as if he'd seen me before, or maybe as if he'd been looking for me. I didn't know his name. I didn't know what he did for a living. But everything about him radiated quiet power, not the loud look at me kind of wealth I saw on display all around the room, but the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, the kind that moves the world without raising its voice. A waiter passed between us, breaking the moment, and when I looked again, he was gone. Just gone. I scanned the crowd, trying not to make it obvious, but he'd vanished into the swirl of tuxedos and gowns. For some reason, that left me with a strange ache, like I'd lost something I hadn't even had yet. I didn't know it then, but that wouldn't be the last time our eyes would meet that night. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe the man with the silver hair hadn't been looking at me at all. It was easier to believe that than to think someone like him had noticed me. An hour passed in a blur of polite smiles, quick steps, and little conversations I barely paid attention to. The band had started playing something slow and smooth, the kind of music that makes the air feel warmer. Guests began drifting onto the dance floor, women laughing as their partners spun them under the golden light. I was restocking pens on the far end of the room when I felt it again, that prickle along my skin. I looked up, and there he was. This time, he wasn't across the room. He was walking toward me. I froze, my mind instantly running through 100 reasons why a man like him would need to speak to me. Maybe he had a question about the auction. Maybe he was lost. Maybe I had spinach in my teeth from the one canapé I'd managed to grab earlier. But when he stopped in front of me, none of those theories made sense. He didn't look rushed or distracted. He just looked focused on me. Would you dance with me? His voice was deep but not loud, smooth in a way that made it feel like a secret only I was supposed to hear. I blinked. Oh, I glanced down at my clipboard like it was some kind of excuse. I'm actually working, so I won't keep you long, he said, and there was something in his tone that wasn't pushy, but certain. Like he already knew I'd say yes, and I did. I don't even know why. Maybe it was the way he extended his hand, steady and patient. Maybe it was the way the room seemed to fade when he was standing that close. I set my clipboard down on the nearest table and slipped my hand into his. His palm was warm, his grip firm but gentle. He led me to the dance floor, weaving through the other couples until we found a spot under the chandelier's golden glow. The music wrapped around us, a slow rhythm that felt like it belonged to a different time. His hand settled lightly on my waist, and I rested mine on his shoulder. We didn't speak at first, we just moved. I could feel the strength in the way he guided me, every step certain, every turn effortless. When he finally spoke, his eyes stayed on mine. You don't look like you belong here. It should have sounded like an insult, but it didn't. Somehow, it felt like the most honest thing anyone in that room could have said. And you do? I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled, not the polite, practiced kind I'd seen all night, but something real. Not anymore. And just like that, the space between us disappeared, and the rest of the world fell away. The song ended too quickly. I was still caught in that warm haze when he stepped back, though he didn't let go of my hand right away. There was a quiet moment, almost like he was deciding something, and then he said, "Come with me." It wasn't a command, more like an invitation, one I knew I shouldn't accept, and yet I did. We stepped off the dance floor, weaving past the other guests, until we reached a quieter corner of the ballroom. From here, I could see everything: the glittering crowd, the flash of diamond jewelry, the champagne bubbles catching the light, but it all felt distant, like we were standing outside of it. "I'm Daniel," he said, offering his hand again, as if we hadn't already been holding each other moments ago. "Maya," I replied, my voice softer than I expected. He nodded, like the name meant something to him. Then he asked the kind of question people in this room never asked me. "Do you like working events like this?" I laughed under my breath. "Honestly, they're exhausting. Beautiful, but exhausting." He smiled, that same unguarded smile from the dance floor. I know the feeling. That's when I asked it, almost without thinking. "So, what do you do?" He hesitated, not in a secretive way, more like he was deciding how much to say. "I own a few companies, investments, real estate, technology here and there." I raised an eyebrow. "A few?" He chuckled. "A few hundred." The words didn't land right away, but then it clicked. The tailored suit, the quiet confidence, the way people seemed to give him space without him asking for it. I had just danced with one of the most powerful men in the city. And then came the other truth. He was at least 50, maybe older, twice my age. The thought flickered in my mind like a warning light, but it was quickly drowned out by the calm way he looked at me, like the difference didn't matter. Still, I couldn't ignore the question rising in my chest. Why me? Out of everyone here, why me? He didn't give me an answer, not then, but I had the feeling I was about to find out. I thought that would be it: a dance, a polite conversation, and then we'd both drift back into our separate worlds. But as the night went on, Daniel kept finding his way back to me. It started small. I was refilling pens at the auction table when I caught a glimpse of him across the room, talking to a cluster of men in expensive suits. Then, just as quickly, his eyes found mine again. He excused himself without hesitation and walked straight toward me. "You look like you could use a break," he said, glancing at the clipboard in my hands. I laughed softly. "That obvious?" He didn't push for small talk. Instead, he asked questions no one at these events ever bothered to ask. About my job, where I grew up, what kind of music I liked. And he actually listened. Not the polite nodding kind of listening, but the kind where you feel seen. I found myself telling him things I didn't normally share with strangers. How I'd stumbled into event planning after college. How I still dreamed of opening my own little cafe someday. How I loved old jazz records because they made the world feel slower. When I mentioned jazz, something shifted in his expression, like I'd touched a memory. "I used to play the piano," he said, "a long time ago." For a moment, I almost forgot where we were. We could have been sitting in a quiet cafe, not standing in a ballroom worth millions. The noise of the gala faded under the sound of his voice. Then someone called his name from across the room. A tall woman in a glittering gown, holding a glass of wine. I expected him to leave, but he didn't. He stayed with me until I excused myself to get back to work. Before I could walk away, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small card, and pressed it into my hand. in case you ever want to hear some live jazz. I glanced down at the embossed number, the weight of the card in my palm feeling heavier than paper should. I didn't know it then, but that single gesture would change everything. I didn't call him right away. For 3 days, his card sat on my kitchen counter, staring at me every time I walked past. My friends had very strong opinions, most of them involving the words too old and too rich. They said it like both were warning labels. And maybe they were. But every time I thought about throwing the card away, I remembered the way he'd listened to me that night. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. It was a rare thing, and I wasn't ready to let it go. On the fourth night, I sent a short text about that live jazz. His reply came almost instantly. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the Blue Room. The Blue Room wasn't just any place, it was the jazz club in the city. People booked tables weeks in advance, and yet, when I arrived the next evening, the hostess led me straight to a small corner table where Daniel was already waiting. He stood when he saw me, smiling in that unguarded way that made the rest of the world feel far away. I'm glad you came. The table was set with a single candle, the light catching the deep lines at the corners of his eyes, lines that didn't make him look old, but seasoned, like someone who'd lived through more than most. The music began, slow and smoky, the kind that makes you want to lean in closer. We talked between songs, and I learned more about him in one night than I had about some people I'd known for years. He told me about growing up in a small town, starting his first business at 21, losing it all at 24, and building it back again. He spoke with the kind of honesty that made the successes sound just as real as the failures. I told him about my cafe dream, and instead of nodding politely, he asked what I'd serve, how I'd decorate it, what the name would be. For a moment, I let myself imagine it, me, running my own place, and him walking in one evening just like this. By the time the band played its last song, I realized something unsettling. I hadn't thought once about the age gap all night. After that night at the Blue Room, things began to move in a way that felt both slow and unstoppable, like a river you didn't realize was carrying you until you looked back and saw how far you'd come. Daniel wasn't flashy with his affection, but he was intentional. A week after our first date, a bouquet of white lilies arrived at my office. No note, just the flowers. I didn't need one to know who they were from. Another time, he sent a vintage jazz record to my apartment, wrapped in brown paper with a single line written on the back. For the mornings when the world feels too fast. We started seeing each other regularly. Sometimes he'd pick me up in a sleek black car with tinted windows. Other times he'd suggest something simple, coffee at a tiny cafe, a walk along river just as the sun was setting. It wasn't the extravagance that drew me in. It was the way he was present. He never checked his phone mid-conversation. He remembered the tiniest details about things I'd said. But as much as I loved being with him, I couldn't ignore the shift when we stepped into public together. Heads would turn. People would glance, look away, then glance again. Some stares were curious, others less kind. I could almost hear their thoughts. She's young enough to be his daughter. She's just after his money. One afternoon, we went to an art exhibit. As I leaned in to admire a painting, I overheard two women whispering behind me. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Gold digger, shameless, probably won't last a month. I pretended not to notice, but my chest tightened. Later that night, I told Daniel about it. He didn't get angry, but his jaw tightened in a way that told me he wasn't unaffected. People see what they want to see, he said quietly. But I know what this is. I know what you are. It should have been enough to hear that, and in some ways it was. But I'd be lying if I said the whispers didn't linger. Still, the more time I spent with him, the easier it became to block out the noise. One evening, we sat in his library, a room lined with floor to ceiling bookshelves, drinking wine while rain tapped against the windows. He told me about his late nights building his first company, the friendships he'd lost, the sacrifices he'd made. I realized then that the man people saw in public, polished, untouchable, was only part of him. The rest was quieter, more human, and I was falling for all of it. I didn't know where this was heading. I just knew I didn't want it to end. It happened on a Tuesday morning, and I wasn't prepared for it at all. I was in line at my favorite coffee shop, half awake and scrolling through my phone, when a headline stopped me cold. Billionaire Daniel Whitmore, spotted with mystery young companion, gold digger or genuine love. The photo beneath it was from the art exhibit. I was mid-laugh, my hand lightly resting on his arm, and the caption beneath it made me sound like a plot twist in some scandalous novel. At first, I told myself to ignore it, but then I made the mistake of reading the comments. People who didn't even know me were dissecting my life in cruel little paragraphs. They speculated about my plans, my real age, even my upbringing. The ugliest ones claimed I'd latched onto him for financial security, that I'd leave as soon as I got what I wanted. By the time I got my coffee, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't see Daniel until that evening. I'd spent the day wrestling with whether or not to bring it up, but the moment he walked through my apartment door, I blurted it out. "Have you seen it? The article." His expression didn't change much, but his eyes softened in that way they did when he saw I was hurt. "I've seen it," he said. "And you're okay with it?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Because I'm not. I can't just pretend this stuff doesn't get to me." He stepped closer, but I took a small step back. "Maya," he said gently, "people talk. They always have. When I was building my first company, they called me reckless. When I sold it, they called me greedy. And now, because I'm with you, they call you names. It says more about them than it does about us." "I know that in my head," I admitted, "but it's different when it's everywhere." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of rain outside filled the silence. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "If this is too much for you, I'll understand." "I don't want you to feel trapped." That hit me harder than the article. He was giving me an out, opening the door for me to walk away. And for a split second, I almost considered it. But as I stood there, looking at the man who'd never once made me feel small, I realized something. If I left now, I'd be proving every stranger on the internet right. "I'm not going anywhere," I said finally. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that day, I felt like I could breathe again. The Hearts for Hope Gala came around again exactly 1 year after the night we first met. Part of me didn't want to go, not after everything that had been written about us over the past months. But Daniel insisted. "It's where it all started," he said, "and I'm not letting a handful of gossip dictate where we belong." I wore a deep emerald dress, one I'd chosen because it made me feel strong, not beautiful in the delicate princess way, but in the I know who I am way. When we stepped out of the car, the flashes started instantly. Photographers calling Daniel's name, their lenses swinging toward me like I was an unexpected guest in my own story. Inside, the ballroom was just as dazzling as I remembered. Gold light spilling over the crowd, champagne flowing, the hum of polite laughter filling the air. But this time, I wasn't here as staff. I was on his arm. The whispers started quickly. I felt them at my back, the weight of eyes tracking us. My grip on his arm tightened. He noticed but didn't comment. Midway through the night, the host took the stage to thank the evening's sponsors. When Daniel's name was announced as the event's top donor, polite applause filled the room. I thought he'd just nod and sit back like always. Instead, he rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the microphone. I felt my stomach twist. He hated public speaking unless it was about business. What was he doing? He thanked the charity, spoke briefly about their cause, and then, without warning, said, "But tonight, I want to thank someone else." The room went quiet. "My life has been measured in contracts and headlines for too long," he continued, his voice steady. "But a year ago, in this very ballroom, I met a woman who reminded me that connection is worth more than any deal I'll ever close. She has taught me that love isn't about appearances or numbers or age. It's about seeing someone for who they are and choosing them every single day." Every head in the room turned toward me. My face burned, but I didn't look away from him. He smiled in my direction, the same quiet, unshakable smile from our first dance. "Maya, thank you for choosing me." It wasn't a grand proposal. It wasn't some over the top gesture meant to impress. It was simple. It was honest. And in that moment, it was enough to silence the noise. When he returned to his seat, I didn't care who was watching. I leaned in, took his hand, and whispered, "Always." And for the first time in months, I felt completely, unapologetically at peace. In the weeks after the gala, something shifted. Not in the world around us. People still whispered. The tabloids still hunted for their scandal. But inside me, I stopped carrying the weight of other people's expectations. I stopped trying to be less so others could feel more comfortable. Daniel's words that night had been a public declaration, yes, but more than that, they were a reminder of something I'd almost forgotten. I was enough exactly as I was. We started spending more time at the lake house, away from the city, away from the noise. Mornings were quiet except for the sound of coffee being poured and the soft shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood floor. I'd sit on the porch with a book while he read the paper, and sometimes we wouldn't speak for an hour. But it was the kind of silence that felt full, not empty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water gold, he asked, "Do you ever regret it, choosing me, knowing the world would make it harder?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had once been a mystery across a crowded ballroom now sat beside me, his hair touched with more silver than when we met, his eyes still carrying that mix of strength and vulnerability I'd fallen for. "Never," I said. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner." He reached for my hand, holding it like it was the most valuable thing he owned. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still moments of tension, times when a headline would sting, or when his business demanded more than I wished it would. But love, I learned, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. The night of our first anniversary, he surprised me with a simple dinner, just the two of us. No photographers, no speeches, no gowns. Just us in the kitchen, cooking together, laughing over burnt bread, dancing to an old jazz record until we were breathless. And as we swayed, I realized that the world could keep its opinions, its gossip, its judgment. Because here, in his arms, I'd already won the only thing that mattered. Love. The kind you choose. The kind that chooses you back. Always. If you've ever felt judged for who you love, remember, your story is yours to live. If you want more stories like mine, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. Trust me, the next one might just make you believe in love all over again.